It's November 15th, 2025, and the atmosphere in Tokyo feels suffocatingly tense. On the surface, the scene looks almost ceremonious. You see Japan's newly elected Prime Minister, Sanai Takaichi, stepping up to the podium. She cuts a striking, disciplined figure dressed in a sharp navy blue suit and wearing a strand of white pearls, a deliberate visual homage to her idol, Margaret Thatcher. Seeing the first female prime minister in Japan's history, you might instinctively expect a moment of progressive celebration or perhaps a speech about economic reform. But then she opens her mouth, and that polite illusion shatters. Instead of the cautious, pacifist diplomacy the world has come to expect from Japan for the last 80 years, she delivers a statement with jagged edges. A direct warning that a Chinese move on Taiwan will force a Japanese military response. The reaction was instantaneous and visceral. It was so volatile that across the East China Sea, a Chinese diplomat reportedly lost his composure entirely, logging onto social media to call the Japanese leadership a dirty duck that needed its head chopped off before frantically deleting the post. Yet what truly struck me wasn't the diplomatic insults or the sudden travel warnings. It was the eerie calmness of Takaichi's underlying logic. This is a leader who visits the Yasukuni Shrine, where convicted war criminals are enshrined, and argues that Japan's era of apology is over. She suggests that the leaders of World War II weren't villains to be condemned, but simply men who failed to win. That psychological shift from a nation defined by decades of constitutional pacifism to one suddenly eager to rewrite its dark history and brandish weapons to restore national dignity feels like a tectonic plate slipping. It forces us to ask, is this just one politician's radical ambition, or has the soul of Japan fundamentally changed while the rest of the world wasn't looking? Okay, so let's unpack this. This deep dive is our attempt to really get to the core of what is driving this huge pivot under Takaichi.
Right, because it is a huge shift.
Yeah.
We're looking at a potential change in Japan's entire post-war defense posture, and that has massive implications for the whole region, especially with Taiwan.
So our mission here is to understand what's driving it. We're going to look at this crisis from, I think, three really interconnected angles.
Exactly.
First, there's the obvious geopolitical and defense shift, Takaichi's new doctrine on Taiwan, and just the sheer diplomatic explosion it caused.
The end of that old pacifist ambiguity.
Right. Second, we have to look inside Japan. What's the socio-political engine here? You know, the ultra-conservatism, the historical revisionism, that whole domestic debate over national identity that got her elected.
The factors that have been bubbling under the surface for a long time.
And finally, we have to look at the economic reality, the price tag. Because Beijing didn't wait to retaliate, and they have some very powerful tools.
And it's so fascinating how Takaichi has really weaponized the work of her predecessors. You know, she's taken these ideas that were once on the far right fringe and just pulled them right into the center of government policy.
So this isn't just a tough politician talking.
No, not at all. This is the culmination of decades of conservative effort to dismantle those post-war constraints. It's a fundamental change, and I think the world is really just now starting to adjust its expectations of what Japan is as a security power.
Let's jump right into that trigger event then. The moment this all boiled over. It was November 7th, 2025 in the Japanese parliament.
That's right. Takaichi stands up and says point blank that a Chinese attack on Taiwan could be seen as an existential crisis under their security legislation.
And existential crisis is more than just a dramatic phrase, right? It's a legal term with very specific consequences. It's basically a war footing.
It is the ultimate legal tripwire. Its significance is, well, it's hard to overstate. That statement gives the specific legal justification for Japan to use its military. For a country with a pacifist constitution, that is a monumental step.
It's the Juji Eikyuchitai, as it's known in Japanese law, right? A situation that threatens Japan's very survival.
Exactly. And this isn't a new concept she just invented.
No, this has been in the works for a while. This goes back to former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, doesn't it?
It does. The whole framework was codified back in 2015 with the legislation for peace and security. Before that, Japan's constitution basically said force could only be used if Japan itself was directly attacked, period.
But Abe's legislation reinterpreted Article 9 of the Constitution.
Without formally changing it, which is the key, it carved out these specific exceptions, allowing Japan to act in collective self-defense. So if an ally like the U.S. is attacked and that attack threatens Japan's survival, then Japan can act.
It always seemed like a brilliant, if controversial piece of political engineering. Abe couldn't get a full constitutional amendment passed because the public was against it. So he just created this super high legal bar, the existential crisis, that could justify war without ever saying we're not pacifists anymore.
And that's the nuance Takaichi's now just blowing past. The law always said the government would decide what an existential crisis is on a case-by-case basis. So most prime ministers, even Abe sometimes, were very vague about Taiwan to avoid poking the bear in Beijing.
But Takashi just got rid of that vagueness.
Completely. By saying a Taiwan situation could meet that threshold, she's signaling that Japan is ready to interpret its own laws in the most expansive way possible. It makes Japanese intervention with the U.S. not just a possibility, but a near certainty.
And she's got the track record for this. I mean, she's always been very pro-Taiwan. She famously repeated Abe's line, "A Taiwan emergency is a Japan emergency." She even visited Taiwan back in April of 2025.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't some off-the-cuff remark. It's the crystallization of her core beliefs. Her rhetoric reflects a strategic view that many Japanese conservatives now hold, that the security of Japan's southern islands, the Ryukyus, is completely tied to Taiwan's fate.
If Taiwan falls to Beijing, the East China Sea becomes a Chinese lake.
And their forces are right on Japan's doorstep. I mean, when she met with Taiwan's former vice premier earlier in November, China immediately protested. Yeah. So this parliamentary statement was just her making it official for the whole world to hear.
And the reaction from Beijing? It was not subtle. Let's talk about the diplomatic rupture. We mentioned that post on X, a platform where you'd expect, a certain level of decorum.
The response was just shocking in how crude it was. The Chinese consul general in Osaka, a man named Xi Jian, he got on X and posted a personal threat. The original Japanese text was something like, "We have no choice but to cut off that dirty neck that has lunged at us. Are you ready?"
Cut off that dirty neck. I mean, that crosses every diplomatic line. It's practically a threat of assassination, even if it is metaphorical.
It's an unbelievable display of hostility from a diplomat. And even though the post was deleted pretty quickly, which suggests maybe he was told to take it down, the damage was already done. It set off a political firestorm inside Japan.
So there were calls to expel him, right? To declare him persona non grata.
Immediately. From all parties. Declaring a diplomat persona non grata is the nuclear option, diplomatically speaking. It means the host country says, "You're unacceptable, get out." It was a huge signal of domestic outrage.
And Takashi, of course, didn't back down.
Not an inch. She refused to withdraw her own remarks, just saying they were consistent with her government's position.
So then you saw the whole diplomatic dance begin. Ambassadors were summoned, protests lodged, counter-protests fired back.
A total viper's nest.
Exactly. China's deputy foreign minister summoned the Japanese ambassador to protest. The Japanese ambassador rejected it and protested the dirty neck comment. Then, Japan's deputy foreign minister summoned the Chinese ambassador.
His argument was very telling, wasn't it?
Oh, very. He basically said Takeuchi was misjudging the situation and, quote, overestimating Japan's capabilities. It was China trying to just dismiss her, to paint her as some overeager amateur who didn't know her place.
But they didn't just stop at words. They used visuals, too. Something the Japanese media called out right away as being designed for humiliation. This was psychological warfare. Yes, what's known as humiliating diplomacy. It happened during a meeting between the two countries' directors general for Asian affairs. The Chinese side just unilaterally let reporters into the room to take pictures, which is a massive breach of protocol.
And the photos were staged.
Meticulously. The picture showed the Chinese official, Liu Jinsong, wearing a very severe traditional Mao suit, speaking forcefully. The Japanese official, Kanai, was photographed listening with his head down, looking subordinate.
Like a student being scolded by the teacher.
Precisely. The Japanese media saw it as a clear attempt to manipulate public opinion, to frame Japan as the inferior power. It wasn't a message for Tokyo. It was a message for the Chinese public and for the world.
Which brings us to the big strategic debate. Was Takeuchi right to do this? Her critics say she gave up strategic ambiguity for no reason. But you could almost argue that China's insane overreaction actually helped her politically at home, right?
That's a fantastic point. She absolutely benefited from it. I mean, yes, her critics, like her LDP rival, Shigeru Ishiba, said she revealed Japan's hand unnecessarily. They argue that for years, ambiguity was the point. It kept China guessing.
But when the Chinese consul general threatens to chop off your leader's head...
It completely validates her central argument. She can now turn around and say, see? This is the existential threat I was talking about. It turns a risky diplomatic gamble into a huge domestic political win for her.
So let's dig into that idea of strategic ambiguity. Why is it eroding? Why do her supporters think this new clarity is so necessary?
Well, strategic ambiguity, which you can trace back to someone like Henry Kissinger, it worked for decades because the power balance was totally different. The People's Liberation Army, the PLA, was technologically behind. It was regionally focused. So being vague worked as a deterrent.
But the PLA isn't weak anymore.
Not even close. It's strong, it's capable, it's assertive, especially around Taiwan and the East China Sea. So the thinking now in Takaichi's camp is that ambiguity looks like weakness. It risks Beijing miscalculating and thinking that Japan or the U.S. won't actually do anything.
So she's trying to remove the possibility of a miscalculation.
Exactly. She's forcing Chinese leaders to confront the real possibility of a Japanese military response. I mean, as one analyst pointed out, if a conflict over Taiwan could never be an existential crisis, there would have been no reason to even put that clause into the law in 2015. Takaichi just closed the loop between the law and the political will to use it.
That's a powerful distinction. But we have to remember, all this high-level strategy, it's having a profound impact on ordinary people on the ground, far from Tokyo.
Absolutely. The human consequences are very real, especially on Japan's periphery. There's this incredibly poignant account from a woman named Emi who lives on Yonaguni Island.
That's Japan's westernmost point, right? You can see Taiwan from there.
On a clear day, yes, it's the absolute front line. For most of her life, Emi's world was defined by farming and the sea. But she said that right after Takaichi's statement, she started hearing a new sound, a constant, heavy metallic sound.
Military hardware.
Transport trucks carrying missile batteries. Yonaguni has seen a huge expansion of its self-defense force garrison. They've installed advanced missile systems, probably the Type 12 surface-to-ship missiles designed to block Chinese ships.
So for the people living that, this buildup doesn't feel like a shield?
It feels like a magnet. Her fear is that their quiet island is being turned into the first target in a war they never asked for. She knows that if a conflict breaks out, the garrison is the first thing China will try to take out.
It just changes the entire meaning of security. When the government in Tokyo talks about national strategy, she's thinking about incoming fire.
That's the core of it. She ended her story with this really powerful line, something like, "Tokyo speaks of strategy. We are just measuring the distance to the other shore." It just perfectly illustrates how the real cost of this new assertive posture is being paid first by the people living on those islands.
That story really brings it home. Okay, so let's pivot and look at the domestic engine that's driving all of this. Because Takaichi's military pivot, it didn't come from a moderate. It comes from a leader with a very, very specific ideology.
Yes, her ideology is really the product of decades of conservative organizing within her party, the LDP. She's described by everyone as an ultra-conservative, a right-wing ultra-nationalist. And critically, she's a member of Nippon Kaigi.
The Japan Conference. For people who aren't familiar, this isn't just some political club. It's a hugely influential, almost shadowy, far-right organization.
It's an ideological engine. Their main goals are, 1, to completely reinterpret Japanese history to restore national pride, and 2, to formally revise the pacifist constitution, especially Article 9. And Takaichi's views just flow directly from that agenda.
Her social positions are extremely conservative.
Extremely. She's against same-sex marriage. She's against letting married couples have separate surnames because she thinks it would destroy the family unit. And importantly, she opposes letting a woman ascend to the imperial throne.
So it's about defining a true traditional Japan, but internationally, the most explosive part of her ideology is her view on World War II, or historical revisionism.
Right, and that's the source of so much tension with China and South Korea. She has a very negative view of apologies for war crimes. Specifically, she rejects the two big ones, the Murayama Statement from 1995 and the Kono Statement from 1993.
Let's just quickly define those, because they really are the bedrock of Japan's post-war identity.
Of course. So the Kono Statement was the official acknowledgement of the Imperial Japanese Army's role in forcing women into sexual slavery, the so-called comfort women. The Murayama Statement was broader, expressing deep remorse and a heartfelt apology for Japan's colonial rule and aggression.
These were Japan's attempts at reconciliation.
And Takaichi essentially dismisses them. She says Japan shouldn't have to keep apologizing. Her viewpoint is chillingly simple. She argues that the leaders of World War II weren't villains, they were just men who failed to win the war.
Implying their cause was just, but they just lost.
Exactly. She's even said that Japan's war was a war of self-defense, casting Imperial Japan as a victim, not an aggressor.
And this isn't just talk. She demonstrates this conviction with her regular, very public visits to the Yasukuni Shrine.
Yes. The Yasukuni Shrine is where 14 convicted Class O war criminals are honored. Her visits are pure political theater. She's even said that when Japan acts ambiguously, like by not visiting Yasukuni to please its neighbors, that China and Korea will just climb up and take advantage. For her, going to the shrine is an act of defiance. It's about restoring national dignity.
So her rise is really about mobilizing a domestic base that's tired of what they see as 80 years of, national apology. Let's see how this plays out domestically, specifically on immigration. Her party is in a coalition with the populist Japan Innovation Party.
Right, the Nipponishin Nokai. And that coalition was a very clear signal. This party wants to put a hard cap on the number of foreign residents in Japan, arguing that more foreigners equals more social tension.
And Takaichi has adopted that hardline stance herself.
She has. She's called for a crackdown on illegal migration, and she's very clear that foreign nationals must strictly obey Japanese law. Her whole approach frames foreigners as a security problem that needs to be managed, not as an economic necessity.
Her proposed policies are all about control and surveillance.
Exactly. She wants a new agency to tackle things like visa overstays, over-tourism, and very specifically, land purchases by foreigners near strategic assets like military bases. It's all sold under the banner of national security, playing on public anxiety.
But this runs headfirst into what you could call the nationalists' paradox, right? Japan's demographics are in freefall, but the political rhetoric is intensely anti-immigrant.
It is the biggest structural contradiction in Japan today. It shows how incoherent the whole nationalist economic platform is. I mean, Japan just had its largest annual population drop ever, almost 1 million people in 1 year. The society is aging so fast, and key sectors like construction and elder care are desperate for foreign workers.
Foreigners are only about 3% of the population, and yet they're framed as this huge social problem.
It's completely illogical. And this focus on control rather than inclusion just makes the labor crisis worse.
We have that story that just perfectly captures this dissonance. The story of Mr. Tanaka, a retired factory owner.
Yes, Mr. Tanaka is the emotional core of Takeichi's base. He's nostalgic for that old, homogenous Japan. He spends his days online reading Japan First articles, agreeing with all the rhetoric about foreign crime and the need for restrictions.
But his own life depends entirely on a foreign worker.
Completely. The person who gives him his daily care, helps him with meals, with mobility, with his medical bills, is a woman named Maria, a care worker from the Philippines.
So he's living in this ideological bubble that's being held up by the very person his ideology wants to exclude.
It's a stark contradiction. The anecdote described him yelling at the TV about foreign crime 1 minute, and then the next minute, sincerely thanking Maria for her help. He just can't connect the two. It shows how this isolationist ideology is just crashing into the reality of who's actually doing the essential work in Japan.
Let's go back to the international stage. Beijing knows that Takeichi's position is ideological, so they've responded with equally ideological and very harsh attacks against her personally.
I've been relentless.
Yeah.
China's state media has used all sorts of vulgar insults, but the most serious warning came from the PLA Daily, the official newspaper of their military. It published an article warning that Takeichi's comments revealed a wolfish ambition.
A wolfish ambition? And what was the warning?
They said her actions would lead Japan down a path of no return and risk tying the entire nation to a chariot of self-destruction. This is way beyond normal diplomatic criticism. They're trying to paint her as a dangerous warmonger to the rest of the world and undermine her at home.
But then China went even further. They launched an ideological counterattack that directly challenged Japan's own sovereignty.
They did. This was a major escalation. The Global Times published an editorial that called for deconstructing Japan's one-sided narrative of annexation. And their target was very specific. They explicitly questioned Japan's sovereignty over Okinawa, calling it by its old name, the Ryukyu Islands.
And Okinawa is where all the key U.S. military bases are. It's a fundamental Japanese territory.
By targeting Okinawa, China turned the history debate into a live territorial dispute. It serves a few purposes. It plays on old historical grievances about Okinawa's status after World War II. It tries to destabilize the very national identity Takaichi's trying to build. And it puts huge pressure on the U.S. alliance. It was a direct, massive counter-provocation.
Okay, so if the first part was the legal crisis and the second was the ideological one, this third part is about the cost, the price tag. And China has a long history of using its economic power as a weapon. They didn't waste any time here.
No, they are absolute masters of economic coercion. And they always use these targeted measures that cause maximum pain, but give them some deniability. They went right for the arteries: tourism, trade, and culture.
So give us the numbers. What was the immediate economic hit?
It was staggering. Just days after Takechi's comments, China advised its citizens to avoid non-essential travel to Japan. All the big Chinese airlines started offering free refunds. By November 20th, analysts figured around 543,000 airline tickets from China to Japan had been canceled. That's about 40% of all Chinese bookings for the next few months.
And the financial loss from that must have been huge, not just for airlines, but for the whole tourism industry.
The initial estimates were between $500 million and $1.2 billion in just the first few weeks. But the bigger fear is that if the boycott continues, the total losses could top $11 billion. That's almost 0.3% of Japan's GDP. A huge hit. The Tokyo stock market reacted instantly, especially companies that rely on Chinese tourists.
And what about trade?
They went for sensitive sectors. They temporarily stopped all imports of Japanese seafood using the Fukushima water testing as a pretext. The Chinese spokesperson just said there was no market for it right now. And all the talks to resume Japanese beef exports, which farmers were counting on, were just suspended indefinitely.
This is their standard playbook, isn't it?
It is. They did the same thing to South Korea over the THAAD missile system and to Australia when they had a diplomatic spat. The tactic is always swift, targeted, and sends a very clear message. If you cross us diplomatically, you'll pay an immediate economic price.
And they also went after Japan's soft power, that cultural influence.
Yes, the cultural freeze. This is about creating social distance. They postponed the big Tokyo-Beijing forum. They canceled the release of several really popular Japanese movies, like the new Crayon Shin-chan film. Concerts by Japanese musicians were shut down. It's a way of punishing the idea of Japan in the minds of the Chinese public.
Let's bring this down to the street level. What does this mean for an actual Japanese business owner? We have the story of Kenji, the parts manufacturer in Osaka.
Kenji's story is the perfect example of this friction between national security and economic survival. He runs a second-generation business making specialized gears for high-end electronics. For decades, his whole business was built on a deep relationship with firms in Shenzhen, China.
But now, under Takechi's new economic security push, his parts are considered sensitive.
They're considered dual-use technology.
Right.
So he's now subject to what's called administrative guidance.
Administrative guidance, that sounds soft, but it's not, is it? How does it actually force a company to cut off its main source of income?
That's the key. In Japan, administrative guidance, or yusei shido, isn't technically law. But when a powerful ministry issues guidance, business is treated as a command. You comply to stay on good terms with the regulators. In Kenji's case, the guidance is to restrict his products from going to foreign companies that might use them for military purposes.
So he's being forced to choose national loyalty over corporate survival.
He's caught right in the middle of this decoupling. He has to absorb the geopolitical cost personally. And his story reflects a huge systemic risk that has Tokyo terrified. Japan's top financial regulator has been talking to his megabanks, MUFG, SMFG, Mizuho, about their contingency plans.
Why the banks specifically? What's the risk there?
The sheer scale of their exposure. Those three banks have a combined credit exposure of about $64 billion to China. The regulator's biggest fear is what happens if the U.S. imposes secondary sanctions on China like they did with Russia.
So the Japanese banks would be forced to choose between their U.S. business and their China business.
They couldn't do both. So the regulator is basically running a huge stress test. They're demanding to see the bank's plans for a scenario where they have to rapidly unwind all of that Chinese credit. It just shows how high the awareness of this entanglement risk really is.
And on the security front, China was also making moves. This wasn't just economic.
No. On November 15th, they announced live fire drills in the Yellow Sea. The China Coast Guard also conducted a very aggressive patrol around the disputed Senkaku Islands.
And they tried to create a domestic security narrative as well.
Right. China's Ministry of State Security announced it had just cracked a series of espionage cases involving Japanese intelligence. It was a propaganda move designed to paint Takaichi's government as the aggressor to justify their own response.
So how did the rest of the world react to all this? It seems like it was pretty divided.
Very fractured. Taiwan, of course, was vocally supportive. President Lai Ching-te called China's actions a blow to peace, and then he publicly ate Japanese sushi to show solidarity against the seafood ban.
And Russia sided with China, as expected.
Strongly. The Russian Foreign Ministry called Takeichi's remarks extremely dangerous and told Japan to reflect on its history. It's the same historical narrative, using guilt as a lever.
But the most important reaction was from the U.S., and it was complicated, especially from President Trump.
It's the most telling part of this whole story. Trump's response was very restrained. He avoided any direct criticism of Beijing. Instead, he just kept talking about his very good relationship with China. The official State Department response was also very neutral, just saying they support peace and stability.
It's a classic mixed message. Takaichi is pushing for absolute clarity from the alliance, but the White House is giving her ambiguity. Why?
You have to look at the domestic politics. For Trump, it's all transactional. He probably wants to avoid a big fight that could reignite a trade war. By staying a bit aloof, he keeps his options open with both sides. Backing Takaichi unequivocally would be a direct challenge to Beijing that he doesn't seem to want to make.
So silence from the president, but a very different message from the ambassador on the ground in Tokyo.
And that contrast is everything. The clear, unwavering support Takaichi wanted came from the U.S. ambassador, George Edward Glass. He met with Japan's foreign minister and called China's actions a classic case of Chinese economic coercion. That's very strong, very specific language.
And his message to Takaichi was even stronger.
It was. He told her directly, "We have her back." And he reaffirmed the U.S. commitment to the defense of Japan, including the Senkakus. This split signal, silence from the top, support from the diplomat, is probably a calculated strategy. The State Department reassures the ally, while the president keeps his own political flexibility. For Takaichi, though, the ambassador's words were a huge win. So when you look at all of this, what this deep dive really shows is Takaichi's, her calculated success in forcing this massive shift. She has single-handedly moved Japan onto a new war footing over Taiwan, using that legal framework of the existential crisis. And she has successfully tapped into that ultra-nationalist sentiment at home to do it, challenging the entire post-war consensus. And she's done all of this while weathering this immediate, brutal economic retaliation from Beijing. This wasn't an accident. It was the goal.
And the sheer speed and scale of China's response, canceling 500,000 flights, shutting down trade, the humiliating diplomacy, it just shows the immediate price of this new assertiveness. Takaichi, she seems driven by this deep desire to restore what she calls national dignity and to finally break free from Japan's post-war constraints. And she succeeded in forcing a confrontation, not just with Beijing, but with Japan's own reality for the last 80 years. The result is a nation now standing at a precipice, consciously choosing military assertiveness and geopolitical risk over the economic security that has defined it for decades. The big question now is whether the economic and demographic reality of Japan can actually sustain the aggressive ideology that she has now put at the very heart of the state.